Strong environmentalists sometimes see the free market as the enemy. But is it really true that a free market is the enemy of a clean environment? Or to put it a little more bluntly, is there a opposition between economics and environmentalism? The connections here are a little less obvious than they may at first appear. It certainly can be true that profit-seeking firms operating in an unregulated market will create pollution. A classic example would be a factory that's making some manufactured product. The seller of that product might be perfectly happy, and the buyer of the product might be perfectly happy, but third parties could be affected by the air and water pollution created by the firm. But, one example doesn't prove a general point, and the connection from market production to the environment is maybe less obvious than it at first appears. At a personal level, get a little defensive here, but at a personal level, I'm an economist, but I like canoeing and camping. I drive a hybrid gas-electric car. I recycle my newspapers in cans. I am not the only economist who does this. Conversely, most of the people I know who I would think of as strong environmentalists also drive cars and thus create air pollution, and they create garbage as well. Of course, these individual examples don't prove a broad point either. But here's some systematic evidence. Poor countries with weak markets often have environmental problems that are much worse than rich market-oriented countries. Countries which have tried to eliminate free market forces, like the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, have had some just terrible pollution problems. As the U.S. economy has grown in recent decades, U.S. air and water quality has actually improved on average. Doesn't mean the problems have gone away, but the amount of pollution has been reduced. So perhaps the issue here is the interaction between government and how production happens, not whether it's a free market or not a free market. Perhaps a government which provides a background of contracts and property rights that prevents theft and thus makes a free market possible, can also provide a background of law and regulation to assure that clean air and water are not, in a figurative sense, stolen from people either. Let's investigate the economics of pollution and of how to reduce pollution. The central concept here is the idea of an externality. An externality occurs when a party who is outside of the immediate buyer and seller is directly affected by a transaction. Now, the argument for free markets and why free markets benefit a society is based in part on the notion that when a buyer and a seller voluntarily agree on a purchase, then at least in their own judgment, the deal must have benefited both sides. But when a market transaction affects a third party who was not consulted and did not have to pay as the buyer or receive money as a seller, then this argument that markets benefit all parties does not hold as well. Now, when I talk about a third party being affected, I don't just mean that they disapproved of the transaction for some reason, but I mean that it has a concrete effect on them. So let me give you an example of an externality that could be either positive or negative. Consider an apartment complex where one household hires a really loud band for a party. You can imagine maybe it's New Year's Eve or something like that. Now, the band is happy to be hired. The neighbor who hired the band is happy to hire them. But what about you in the next apartment over? Well, if you really like the music from the loud band, you get a positive externality. You basically get a private concert in your apartment and you get it for free. If you don't like it, then you suffer a negative externality. You have to listen to this music that you didn't want to. But either way, the market deal between your neighbor and the band is not taking you into account. This lecture focuses on pollution, which is probably the most important social example of a negative externality. The next lecture will focus on the most important positive externalities, particularly technology and the development of innovation. To economists, pollution is just a case where third parties are affected by the spillovers from production and consumption decisions, and those third parties were not part of the original market transaction. In the case of the band, you can think of it as noise pollution that's coming over to your place. But you can think of pollution as anything you didn't want, really, but that's something that is imposed on you by the actions of others. For example, cigarette smoke is not pollution to the smoker. The smoker voluntarily agreed to purchase cigarettes. However, it might be pollution to the third party who was not part of the market transaction. And of course, air and water pollution broadly fall into the same category. The idea of an externality can be explained by distinguishing between private costs and social costs. In a typical market transaction, the firm looks at the private costs that it faces when it does the production, and the buyer looks at the private benefits that the buyer receives, and they see whether they can make a deal. But in the case of pollution, not all the costs are private costs that the producer has to pay. Some of the costs are cost of pollution, which are imposed on others. These social costs of pollution are not paid by the firm, and since they aren't paid by the firm won't take them into account. When producers of something that does pollution don't have to take social costs into account, they will tend to produce too much of it. Think back for a moment to the example of the band in the apartment building. What if the neighbors giving that party had to compensate everyone in the building $50 apiece for the inconvenience of having a loud band? Well, they would probably hire the band for a shorter time, or they would hire a quieter band so they only had to pay people $20 instead of $50, or they might not hire the band at all. But if they had to face the social costs of that band, then they would produce less noise pollution. Or you can think of an example of a firm that doesn't have to pay anything at all for dumping its garbage. If it doesn't have to pay anything at all for dumping its garbage, there's likely to be a lot of garbage that's generated and a lot of stuff dumped. But all of a sudden, if that firm has to start paying for dumping its garbage, all of a sudden the firm finds a lot of ways to reduce how much garbage it's creating. And it might start finding ways to reduce its waste and to recycle. And after all, when you think about it, pollution is just garbage, which is dumped into the air or into the water. Now, there are a range of public policies that are available to try and bring private and social costs into line with each other, so that those who are creating the costs of pollution also have to face those costs more directly. Command and control is the name economists give to the set of regulatory policies that specify an amount of pollution that can legally be emitted, but prohibits emitting any larger amount of pollution. Early environmental regulation in the United States in the early 1970s, with the passage of the original Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, essentially took this command and control approach. Now, this approach certainly can be and has been effective. In the most fundamental sense, the air and water, on average, are cleaner now than they were in the early 1970s. People forget what it was like then. Let me give you an example. In the early 1970s, air pollution was so bad in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that, and I'm quoting from a news story here, the death rate from tuberculosis was double that of the rest of Tennessee and triple that of the rest of the United States. This was a city in which the filth in the air was so bad it melted nylon stockings off women's legs, in which executives kept supplies of clean white shirts in their offices so they could change when a shirt became too gray to be presentable. A city in which headlights were turned on at high noon because the sun was eclipsed by the gunk in the sky. I mean, that's what air pollution was like. It's come a long way since then. Since then, many major air pollutants have been considerably reduced. I'm looking at some statistics here from the Environmental Protection Agency. But from 1970 to 2001, the level of particulates in the air fell by 76%. The level of sulfur dioxide in the air fell by 44%. The level of what are called volatile organic compounds, certain kind of chemicals in the air, fell by 38%. The level of carbon monoxide in the air fell by 19%. The level of lead in the air, which was particularly harmful to small children and developmental issues for small kids growing up, fell by 98%, mainly as a result of unleaded gasoline. So the air has definitely become much cleaner over time, even if there are remaining issues like whether or not carbon dioxide may be causing greenhouse warming that we'll talk about later on. It's harder to measure water quality in a consistent way than air quality, but the widespread construction of much better sewage treatment plants and also better provisions for disposing of wastewater from firms has made a huge difference. So when they go out and they do sort of surveys of the rivers and streams and lakes, in general, many more of them are swimmable or fishable or useful for recreational purposes than was true 35 years ago. Now, I don't mean to dismiss or diminish these genuine achievements of command and control environmental regulation when I say that this kind of regulation does have some weaknesses. Let me try and describe the weaknesses in terms of the incentives that it provides to the industry being regulated. One weakness is that the industry being regulated with command and control regulation might seek to influence the pollution standard through the regulatory process. Remember, there's this problem of regulatory capture, and they may try and get the standard set at a higher level. Another difficulty is that command and control regulatory standards are quite inflexible. They often specify exactly what kind of technology is supposed to be used to reduce a certain kind of pollution. Whether it's the best technology in that particular situation, or whether that technology is one size fits all across the country or should be different in different places, is often not particularly addressed. Moreover, command and control regulation often does not reward innovative ways of avoiding pollution in the first place, or reducing pollution below the legal standard. If you're below the legal standard, that's okay. There's no reason to keep reducing pollution lower and lower and lower. Now, one estimate is that a result of this lack of flexibility in these command and control regulations is lack of incentives for going beyond the standard and perhaps reducing pollution even further. It might be, by some economic estimates, that the costs society faces for cleaning up pollution might be literally 2 times as high as necessary. So we could either be cleaning up the existing amount of pollution at half the cost, or we could be cleaning up even more pollution and still having a lower social cost than we do now. So what's the alternative to command and control regulation? The answer would be something that are called market-oriented environmental policies. And the goal here, as you'll be getting this sort of broken record of goal over time, is to work with the market, work with the forces of the market and the incentives the market provides, rather than trying to just command it and control it to do what you want. Let me suggest several flavors of market-oriented environmental policies. One is called a pollution tax. A pollution tax could be used to make sure that polluters face up to the social cost of their pollution. Now, how would a pollution tax work? You would pay a certain amount of this tax per unit of pollution. So, for example, it could be based on emissions of carbon, or emissions of sulfur dioxide, or emissions of stuff that goes into the water. You can view the federal gasoline tax or state gasoline taxes as kind of a cousin of a pollution tax. It's not taxing the pollutant directly, like the carbon or the other things that are emitted, but it's taxing as something that creates pollution as is used. Now, maybe it's not particularly politically attractive to call something a pollution tax. But, you could call it a pollution charge if you want, which sort of has a nicer sound. My point here is not the semantics of the pollution tax, but the notion that you could tax according to how much pollution is emitted. Now, a pollution tax has some very nice features in terms of incentives. For example, a pollution tax gives a reason for continuous innovation in trying to reduce the amount of pollution. Because as long as the firm can reduce pollution, it can reduce its pollution tax. So it's not like command and control. You get below a certain level and you just stop trying to reduce pollution. With a pollution tax, you just keep going and going. Moreover, a pollution tax provides some cash for the government, which, given the state of the federal deficits these few years, the government could certainly handle. A pollution tax also provides no particular method in how to reduce pollution. It's very flexible. It doesn't say you have to reduce pollution using this particular technology, this particular way, this particular time. It just says If you emit, you pay. Now, of course, in a way, a pollution tax is more visible than command and control regulation. It doesn't say this is what you have to do. It really requires you to measure what you're emitting. And that's not always very attractive to firms. It's also called a tax, and as I said, calling it a tax may not be as politically attractive. But it would force firms to face up to the fact that pollution has a social cost, and to pay that cost directly. And that sets up a nice set of incentives for reducing pollution. Let me give you another market-oriented environmentalism way of reducing pollution. It's called marketable permits. A marketable permit works by giving polluters a set of permits to emit a certain amount of pollution. Now, often these permits are scheduled to gradually decrease the amount of pollution that can be emitted over time. They sort of just reduce in a phased down way. That maybe you can emit 100 units and then 80 and then 60 and then 40. However, if a polluter can reduce pollution by more than the amount of the permit, then the permit could be sold to someone else. That's why it's a marketable permit. Or if a new producer wants to enter the market, that new producer has to purchase an emissions permit, a pollution permit from some existing firm. The United States has had some success with marketable permits in certain areas. For example, it was one of the ways that was used to reduce lead in gasoline, that there were marketable permits that could be sold to firms that processed and refined gasoline and then phased down the amount of gasoline over time. It also worked for the reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions that was particularly related to the 1990 version of the Clean Air Act. Firms were given permits to emit a certain amount of sulfur dioxide, and then the amount of those permits ratcheted down over time. Again, if you think about the incentives that these marketable permits provide, they provide a reason to innovate. Because after all, if you can reduce pollution by more, then you can sell the extra permits to others. However, many environmentalists have pretty mixed feelings about these marketable permits. On one side, environmentalists often like the marketable permits because it sets a quantitative limit on the amount of pollution. The pollution tax, remember, didn't set a quantitative limit. It just said if you emit, you pay. And so environmentalists were sometimes concerned, well, how much is actually going to be emitted? But with marketable permits, there's a quantity of permits that are out there. On the other hand, environmentalists often dislike marketable permits because it sounds like social permission to pollute, which of course it is. A marketable permit is social permission to pollute. But, when you think about it, command and control regulation is also social permission to pollute up to a certain level. The only difference is that command and control regulation doesn't give you any incentives to proceed further. Let me give you yet another method of a market-oriented way of controlling pollution. It's to use property rights. The property rights that you have can often affect the incentive to produce or to reduce pollution. Now, let's think about how this might work. One way of thinking about this problem of pollution and property rights is that in an unregulated market, no one has a property right to clean air. And if nobody has a property right to clean air, no one needs to compensate you for infringing on your property right to clean air. If you have a property right to own your land, somebody can't come in your front yard and dump garbage because you own that property. But you don't own the air over your property in the same sense. If you had property rights that were clear and enforceable, then one party or another will have the appropriate incentives to avoid creating the negative externality of pollution. So, let's think about this difficulty of how you might have property rights that could be used in a way to avoid getting the air dirty or having water pollution of one kind or another. A classic example here is due to the great Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase. Coase said that what you wanted to do was think about a train that goes past a farmer's field. And that train is emitting sparks. And sometimes the sparks start a fire in the farmer's field. So we want to think about this example of pollution. The train, it's emitting sparks, the farmer's field is burning. How do we figure out a way to deal with this through property rights? Now, we can tackle this in two different ways. One is we could say, look, a train has a property right to emit sparks. In which case, farmer, it's up to you. You have to figure out how to reduce the chance of fire hitting your field. Alternatively, you could say, look, farmers, you have a property right not to have your field set on fire by sparks from the train. In which case, the railroad has to find a way to reduce the chance of fire or else pay the farmer. Now, whether you give the property right to the railroad and let it emit sparks, or you give the property right to the farmer and say you are protected from the emissions of sparks, that will determine who has to pay. But either way, if the property right is clear, one party has a reason to find a way to reduce the chance of fire and to find the low-cost way of doing that. So when the property rights are clear, often there will be some reason to try and avoid pollution from happening. A classic example would be the ownership of federal lands. No one really owns often federal lands, and so they end up sometimes being abused for various recreational or logging or hunting or other kinds of purposes because they aren't owned. No one has a reason in terms of a property right to protect them. Another application of this idea today is about protecting endangered species. Think about the problem of protecting elephants or rhinoceroses in Africa. If no one owns the elephants or the rhinoceroses, then they're poached for the ivory in their tusks, and their habitat is destroyed for farmland and so on. But if you put them in a sort of a park where they're protected, and then you give everyone who lives around the park an economic incentive from tourism to protect the park, then you may end up with quite a different situation. In this case, people don't literally own the animals, but they have a property right to sort of living around the perimeter of the park and thus to getting a certain kind of tourist revenue. In general, over the last 20 years or so, there's been some movement in environmental regulation away from sort of pure command and control and toward more use of these kinds of market-oriented mechanisms. And in general, economists favor that, and we think we could probably go much further and faster in that direction. To illustrate in a more concrete way how these market-oriented mechanisms might work, let's think about the issue of greenhouse warming, which is obviously one of the big environmental issues of the current time. Now, let me start with a couple of disclaimers here. For the record, I am fully aware that there is some scientific dispute over whether the buildup of carbon emissions in the atmosphere will lead to global warming. There are some reputable scientists on both sides here. I'm also aware there has been a major political dispute over the so-called Kyoto Protocol, which many nations have signed, but the U.S. didn't sign. Of course, not signing the Kyoto Protocol has actually been a bipartisan decision. It wasn't signed under George Bush, and it wasn't signed under President Clinton either. The one time something like the Kyoto Protocol came to an advisory vote in the U.S. Senate in the late 1990s, there was literally a unanimous vote against it. So my point here is I'm not going to take a position on the political arguments of who's at fault and who should have done what. On the scientific arguments, my position for the purposes of this lecture is that at a minimum, there is uncertainty over whether global warming might happen. At a minimum, there are at least some reputable scientists who say it will. And if there is a risk of something happening which is catastrophic, it can be worth taking out an insurance policy against it. Even if you think global warming is only a 10% chance or a 50% chance, you might still feel like it's worth taking out some policy insurance against that by doing something to reduce carbon emissions in the present. So I'm going to sort of shuffle those issues for the purposes of this lecture off into a different place. And let's just assume that we do want to consider a range of ways of trying to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce the risk that greenhouse warming might occur. Well, what's the range of possibilities? Well, we could do command and control regulation. We could have rules, for example, that cars have to reduce their emissions of carbon. We could have rules about a certain number of miles per gallon. We can have rules about emissions from factories. We could have rules about everything that involves emissions of carbon in the economy. So that would be one set of command and control possibilities. We could also have a carbon tax of one sort or another. A carbon tax would be use all the gasoline you want, burn all the fossil fuels you want, but find ways to do it so that as you do those things, you produce less carbon. As I mentioned before, a gasoline tax can be viewed as a form of a carbon tax because it's linked to carbon. But when you think about it, here's the funny thing about a gasoline tax. Imagine that it was possible to come up with a form of gasoline that emitted less carbon in one way or another. Under a carbon tax, you would reward that behavior because you would pay less. You would be emitting less carbon, so you would pay less in the carbon tax. But under a gasoline tax, even if you could find a way to make gasoline emit less carbon, you don't benefit in terms of a gasoline tax. You still have to pay it. So it's not as flexible as focusing on emissions of carbon. You could also use marketable permits for carbon emissions. Perhaps, for example, you could have something about gasoline refineries having to pay for the carbon that will be emitted by the gasoline they refine. Or you could have auto companies pay in some way or another. Now, economists say, these are all possibilities. But if what we want is a set of incentives to reduce carbon emissions and get them out of the atmosphere, we want to give an incentive for people to go beyond the guidelines, we want to give a flexible incentive that will reward all different kinds of behavior, and we don't want to sort of have a set of rules that are going to be gained and negotiated and go back and forth in a way that won't really reduce pollution, then the most hopeful approach is, for economists, maybe some kind of a carbon tax. Now, honest political truth, of course, although I promised to stay out of politics, is that isn't very likely, and we may be forced to go down the road of a lot of command and control regulation. And if we do that, we will certainly reduce the amount of carbon that's out there, but we'll do it in more costly and inflexible ways than if we were to use more market-oriented environmental tools. One final concern about this whole discussion of market-oriented environmental tools is that for many environmentalists, it sort of misses the point because it doesn't get us to zero pollution. And many people sort of feel like zero pollution should be the policy goal. I want to argue with my hard-headed economist hat on that zero pollution is not a realistic or a useful policy goal. I mean, after all, let's be realistic. Zero pollution would mean shutting down most industry and most of the economy, which is just not sensible. Moreover, if you think about it a little bit differently, most pollution has benefits. It has benefits in the sense that the pollution is emitted in the course of producing some useful good that people want to buy and use. In that sense, pollution has benefits in terms of what it allows to be produced, and it also has costs. The reasonable policy goal is to think about balancing these benefits and costs, not just saying the cost should be zero. Nonetheless, the whole idea that we would recognize that pollution has some benefit seems immoral to some folks. I've heard someone say, for some environmentalists, criticism of their beliefs on economic grounds is like criticizing Holy Communion on nutritional grounds. It misses the point. But all of these options, command and control, pollution charges, market-oriented environmental things, marketable permits, property rights, all involve allowing some pollution. And if we're going to take the position that pollution is just a moral wrong no matter what, then allowing pollution is also wrong, and the goal of zero pollution becomes sort of a moral imperative. I just don't believe that this argument for absolutely zero pollution is, at some level, intellectually serious. Try and demonstrate why I like to tell a George Bernard Shaw story. Shaw, as you may know, was an incredibly witty playwright, and the story is that he was at a party with a beautiful woman, and he said to her, "Well, would you sleep with me for £1 million?" And the woman said, "Well, I don't know, And she thought, maybe, perhaps I would." And then Shaw said to her, "Well, would you sleep with me for £5?" And the woman said, "Well, who do you think I am? Of course not." And Shaw said, "We've already determined what you are. Now we're just haggling over the price." In a literal sense, zero pollution means people don't exhale carbon dioxide or create sewage. It would mean shutting down most of industry and most of the economy. This just isn't going to happen. Face it, we are all polluters. Pollution has benefits as well as costs, and all we're doing with pollution regulation is we're haggling over the price. We're haggling over to balance one and the other. The reasonable policy goal for pollution is to think about how to bring social costs and social benefits into line with each other. No matter how strict are the environmental standards you wish to set, no matter how high the pollution tax you'd want to set or how strict the marketable permit rules, market-oriented environmental policies offer a promising way of accomplishing this necessary balancing act. Pollution is, like so many other things, a matter of trade-offs. The real question is not how we eliminate pollution, but how we balance its costs and benefits.